now. Hello, everybody. This is Jacob Jans. Welcome. Today, Megan Sterling is going to be presenting a lecture on unexpected imagery in poetry. This is part of the monthly lecture series from the Writers' Workshop at Authors Publish, where we present lectures on the craft of writing or the business of publishing. So today, Megan will be talking about the art of crafting engaging and meaningful poetry, specifically through the use of unexpected and fresh imagery. She'll be giving plenty of contemporary examples, plus exercises you can use in your own practice. Plus, after the lecture, we're going to be sending everyone a packet that Megan put together with exercises. So you'll be getting exercises in your email after the lecture as well. So Megan Sterling teaches poetry workshops. She lives in Portland, Maine with her family. Her work has been published in a wide range of literary journals and anthologies, including Rattle, Cider Press Review, Literary Mama, and Enough, Poems of Resistance and Protest. She's also the associate editor of the associate poetry editor of the Maine Review, a Dibner Fellow at the 2020 Black Fly Writers Retreat, and a Hugh Noakes Artist Colony resident in 2019 and 2021. Her collection of poetry, These Few Seeds, was just released from Terrapin Books. And she also regularly teaches poetry workshops, and you can learn more about her work and her workshops at megansterling.com. And I encourage you after the lecture to look her up and look up her just released book of poetry. I've started reading it and I've been enjoying it. So without further ado, here is Megan.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some of the things that I've been learning and studying myself as a poet, a published poet and a poet that's always looking to be published more. So something that I've been seeing a lot in my reading of contemporary poetry, my writing poetry, my work as an associate poetry editor for the Maine Review is that I feel that poems are more and more demonstrating meaning through image. And not just any image, but really fresh and unexpected pairings of images. I'll have through this lecture today lots of examples of different kinds of imagery, and I'd say almost all of the poems that I use as examples are very contemporary. Some of them just released, some of them released just in the past 5 years, because I feel that it's important as poets to always be writing things that are going to be received by a modern audience. If what you want is to write work that gets published, that excites people, you want to create poems that are where you're writing things that people are more interested in reading, and focusing on imagery really, I think, is it. So I'm going to start the lecture. Again, you can get copies of the slides. There's going to be a packet with all of the exercises that I have in here. We don't have time for me to do the exercises with you today. That we could do in a poetry workshop at a future date. I actually am teaching a poetry workshop on unexpected imagery May 23rd. That's a Sunday from 2 to 4, where we'll be doing a ton of exercises. But without further ado, I'm going to start the lecture. So let's see here. All right. So, unexpected imagery in poetry. So William Carlos Williams very famously said, "No ideas, but in things." And by things, he means images. So the idea is that how can we use images in a way that really makes the meaning sing? That's what today's lecture is really about. But we're going to start with some background. First, we have a beautiful painting by Chagall. Chagall, of course, is an artist who very famously brought together different images to create these kind of surreal landscapes. And I find so much modern poetry does something quite similar. All right. So the difference between poetry that's great or poetry that's meh, it's details. So many of us, we know how to write poetry. We know basic concepts. We want to use metaphors. We want to use similes. We want to pay attention to sound. We want to pay attention to form. And all of that is still true. But something that is becoming increasingly true is we want those images to really arrest our readers, to make people take a second look. The poetry submitting world is incredibly competitive. I mean, each literary journal gets anywhere, I'd say, from 1,000 and more poems to go through in a single reading, submission period. So how is your poem going to jump out amidst 1,000 others? Focus on the images. But let's talk a little bit about imagery before we start focusing on how to make our imagery fresh. Let's just do a little bit of background talking about what is imagery, different types of imagery. Let's look. All right. So if you think about the greatest poems that you've ever read, usually they do one of two things. They either transport you somewhere or they make you look at your current life in a new way. I find Mary Oliver to be a poet who is a great example of that, because she writes about things that generally are things that all of us do. Go for a walk, observe spring, just having sort of everyday routines and things in her poems, but she makes a twist on it so that you never take that walk the same way after you read that poem. So those are the poems that tend to stand out. So image tends to be the way that we can ground our poems in something fresh, and so that we can either transport our readers or we can give them a totally fresh perspective. Imagery is usually the first thing that you deal with in a poetry workshop. It's one of the first things you do when you're a kid and you're learning about poetry, right? Write about the flower. What color is the flower? The yellow daffodil, the yellow many-petaled daffodil, right? There is a reason that we focus on these things, because these are the things that as a human being, we want to absorb, we want to see, we want to hear, we want to experience things that in a fresh way. So let's go in. So often if you're about to start working on poems or you're revising poems, start with the images, because images can give more of a story than trying to talk about it. Something that I sometimes see in poems is people want a certain meaning to become clear. So they'll often kind of talk about it. An image can do all of that work, right? An image is worth 1,000 words. It's similar, even though we're using words and poetry, but still, to be able to winnow something down to a single beautiful image can do a lot of work and have a lot more power than talking around it. So something that I practice very regularly, and I think it's really important to do, is you start with just a simple observation practice. You go to a place in your life, in your house, in your room, wherever it is you write, a place that's ordinary, and you describe everything. And that's the first layer, right? You describe what's on your desk. You describe what's outside your window. I've written countless poems about this not very exciting view out of my window. And I have found all sorts of interesting things by just focusing on what's outside this window. And then you could write about memories, write about your father's beard, write about maybe the way your mother smelled or the way the kitchen in your home growing up smelled, and just focus on complete images, evoking all the senses. All right, so again, showing, not telling. Telling is the biggest mistake we make in poems. When I'm reading poems, If a poet is getting hung up on telling, describing to me about the fear that is felt or the guilt that is felt, instead, if that poet can somehow convey to me through showing me a buoy adrift in a crashing sea, instead of telling me that this person feels alone, if this person can show me that they feel alone, I'm going to be more moved. I'm going to be more invested. I'm going to relate more deeply. So this is about showing and not telling. Showing the way things feel, showing the way things sound, showing the way things smell. Because in poetry, all we have is show, because all we have are words. You need to have a lot of trust for your reader. That's something very important. When you read a great poem versus a meh poem, a great poem, there's more trust of the reader. I trust you to understand. I trust you to relate. I don't have to tell you how to feel. You're going to get it. And I think that's another really important level. So another practice, write about the last time you were fully immersed in water, whether it was a shower or a bath or swimming in a lake or in the ocean or your feet in a stream, and describe it fully. Oh, and there's Frida Kahlo. All right, so this is an exercise that is in your packet. So sit in a public space for 30 minutes. Observe using all your 5 senses what's happening around you. Record at least 20 different images. Then you come away and spend 30 minutes focusing on your own memories. You write down a number of your memories in as much detail as possible. And then weave these 2 groups of images together. So you're sitting at a park and someone walks by who's wearing a bright red hat and red shoes, mixed in with your memory of your first day of kindergarten and your teacher was wearing a perfume that reminded you of your grandmother. And you weave these lists together. See what happens. Okay, so this is this really cool prompt that I found out about this winter that I use whenever I feel stuck. William Stafford, very famous poet, this was his daily poetry prompt. He used it every single day. He wrote down 10 images he had seen in the last 24 hours. He tended to go for daily walks. So he wrote those 10 images down. Then he had stacks of poetry books around him. He would grab one, open it at random, put his finger down, write down that line. So then he would use that line as either the first line of his poem or he would respond to it. And then he would weave those 10 images into a writing exercise. And then whatever came of that then became his poem of the day. It's actually a really effective poetry prompt. I recommend it to everyone. I learned about it from this wonderful poetry podcast called the Poetry Salon Cast with Trisha Faye Hefner. I found it. It's on, with all podcasts, and it's a wonderful one if you're interested in learning more about craft. Okay, so what are the different kinds of imageries? There are 7 major different kinds. I mean, we could probably distill it and find that there's actually like 100, but let's focus on sort of the 7 major branches of imagery. So we create imagery by using these major, what's the word I'm looking for? Techniques. So either we use similes or metaphors, right? So a simile, we say like or as, we're comparing. Metaphors, we're saying something is something else. It's another way of comparison, but it's as though the thing was something else. So for example, I put here, the house was a mirror. It's not like a mirror, it was a mirror. And these things, of course, are important to distinguish. They each have a different feel. Sometimes I jumble them up just to create interest. Then there's personification, which gives human attributes to non-human things. And then there's automatopoeia, so that's using words that create a sense of the meaning that you're getting across. All right. The first one, and this is always the first one to start with, is visual imagery. Visual imagery, we're describing the way something appears, colors, brightness, shapes, sizes, patterns, just things in general. So I have this example by Kaveh Akbar from his poem Against Dying, very visual poet. At 24, my liver was already covered in fatty rot. My mother filled a tiny coffin with picture frames. I spent the year drinking from test tubes, weeping wherever I went. Somehow it happened, wellness crept into me like a roach nibbling through an eardrum. So we have so many visuals here, right? And it's gruesome, it's gross, but very effective. Fatty rot, tiny coffin, picture frames, test tubes, a roach nibbling through an eardrum, which is also an auditory kind of imagery. Auditory imagery. So, so this appeals to the reader's sense of hearing. This piece was from a poem that came out in the main review by a Nigerian poet named Chisasrauqua. She writes exquisite poems. This is from The Barely Missed Girls. She's a poet who you want to read out loud because the music of what she writes is so exquisite. So, the ash-skinned men with rifles longer than their legs click their tongues and haggle over prospects of tender breasts beneath their palms. Their bellies, cinched and tucked and belted, burst with mama's jollof. Tongues loosened with palm wine beg for girl wives to dine and sleep under. A cough masks a prayer from between mama's teeth. Two misplaced sniffs and they might have smelled our fear in the shadows. So much of the meaning of this poem is coming across in the sounds that she's creating. And that's another kind of imagery. Gustatory imagery. This is evoking the way things taste. Sweetness, sourness, saltiness, savoriness, spiciness. In this case, this poem by Kim Adonisio, who's a wonderful poet, a wonderful poetry workshop leader. This is from her poem, First Kiss. Her mouth gone slack and her eyes turned vague and filmy, as though behind them the milk was rising up to fill her whole head that would loll on the small white stalk of her neck. Again, gorgeous language. Of course, the sounds are being evoked as well, but this sort of the lull and the small and the milk, there's something evocative there of the flavor of milk, of this newborn nursing. I think is really powerful. Okay, tactile imagery. So this one's interesting. So Ocean Vuong is a wonderfully talented poet. This is a section from a very gorgeous poem that he wrote, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. He also writes awesome titles. That's another workshop I'm going to teach, just titles. So here, there's a sensation created. I also think there's sensation created in the white space, the spacing, the form of his poem here. That this amber light, whittled down by another war, is all that pins my hand to your chest. You, drowning between my arms, stay. You, pushing your body into the river, only to be left with yourself, stay. So this feeling, this push-pull that's being created here is being done in all different ways. Drowning between arms, pushing your body into the river, the white space, the dashes, that hesitancy. Olfactory imagery. So this is about things that you smell. So I think this one is quite powerful. Ruth Awad, I'm a big fan. The Years of Water and Light. We fed wild dogs overripe apples and herring. My hands shine with hunger. Her hair hung in willow boughs. Mine in wild onion. I reel the small fish of time. So we can smell it, right? Overripe apples and herring and wild onion and this fish, right? So these senses are being evoked. And it is powerful. And look at the contrast, overripe apples and herring being fed to wild dogs. She's hungry, her hands are shining with it, right? So her hair is hanging in wild onion, right? So again, this is so unusual and interesting to be using these scents to describe and evoke a sense of just hunger. Kinesthetic imagery. So this is about movement, evoking movement. Dana Levin, another really fabulous poet who I've had the great fortune of taking a few workshops with. This is from her poem, Above the Neck. Little winks from the tips of silvered tools, you sat in stars, garage dark, and a skein of bandages on a little stool, wrapped you up, my mental pupa, on a metal folding chair, and all around you synapses pop and flare. I'd been taking the walk called head bobbing on a font of blood. I couldn't believe I had legs as the ditch streamed by, spider egged in a web of squares, chair, house, mind. Iron press of your mummy's suit, head free to swivel and churn. You could break your neck and be alive. Had a lit house sweeping its beam through the constructed reel. I tied you up inside my mind where you're sweating now, fisting under the band, salt in your eye, can't lift a finger. What use had I for hands? So here, all of these descriptions, physical sensations and movement, right, is such an interesting contrast with, in some ways, what's being described, which is about her process of thinking. And then organic imagery. This is the most complex one to explain. It's comparing something to something else that evokes a sensation. It's not maybe a sense being evoked exactly. Robert Frost utilizes this kind of imagery a lot. Here he says, it's when I'm weary of considerations and life is too much like a pathless wood. So it's describing something, it's comparing something to something that maybe the reader has a memory of as well, being that sensation of being lost. And instead of saying like being lost, he says like a pathless wood, a wood with no path. Oh, there's a picture of birches. Okay, this is a really, really important activity to do if you are interested in expanding your ability to write more interesting imagery. Choose one of your favorite poems, a poem that inspires you to write or a poem that you just love. Go to it and go through and circle all of the images, every single one. I haven't done that with all of these. There's even more images. I've tried to focus on the type of imagery I'm focusing on, but go through and circle them all. Then step back and look and ask yourself these questions. How do these images relate to each other? Is it a single image being carried multiple ways throughout the poem, right? Is it sort of a different angle of looking at one image? Is it a series of disjointed images, which is, I think, actually a more popular technique to use lately? Then how does it translate into meaning? How does it align with the topic of the poem? How does it support the voice and style of the poem? So these are such interesting questions to ask yourself as a student of poetry. What is this poet doing that's succeeding so much? And it gives you kind of a blueprint to emulate as you work on your own skills as a writer of imagery. All right, this is one of my favorite poems. I'm a mother of a young daughter, but this is just an exquisite poem. Sylvia Plath was way ahead of her time. So this is her very famous poem, Your. And so it's also an interesting example of a title that continues into the poem, Your. You are clown-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars, and moon-skulled, gilled like a fish. A common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode. Wrapped up in yourself like a spool, trawling your dark as owls do, mute as a turnip from the 4th of July to All Fool's Day. Oh, high riser, my little loaf, vague as fog and looked for like mail, farther off than Australia, bent-backed Atlas, our traveled prawn, snug as a bud and at home like a sprat in a pickle jug, a creel of eels, all ripples, jumpy as a Mexican bean, right like a well-done sum, a clean slate with your own face on. So this, in a sense, it's like a list, right, of all of these different descriptors, and some of them are so fun and funny, of this little baby, right? Comparing her to a clown, to a fish, her head to the moon, right? Or to a little loaf of bread, fog in Australia, and a little shrimp, right? And a pickle and a bean, all of these delightful little comparisons. And of course, she's incredibly skilled. So there's all sorts of wonderful sound and internal rhyme and even end rhyme, right? With the last couplet, some and on is kind of a slant rhyme to end on. So this is a super modern poem. All of these disparate images that all create this kind of delicious picture of this little baby. Oh, there's a chubby little baby. All right, this is a brand new poem that just came out in Narrative Magazine that absolutely wowed me. It's by a young poet, J.P. Glasser. It's called Another Pastoral. So it's a really unique take on a pastoral poem. As most people might know, a pastoral poem is a poem that celebrates nature. This is a poem that was written in response to a lot of the things that have been going on between the people of color and the police. So this is this poem, and I think it's a powerful one. So what, this shit again? Another long plunge down the honeysuckle's throat? Another big-eared bat caught in the vestibule, plastered to the pleated drapes and shooed to freedom with the straw bear broom? Another electric arc of bluebird flight, more flood, more drought, more casts of doily light on the forest floor, more cicada wings chafing towards tinder and flint and fire, always more fire. Again, the river gnaws at the cut bank, produces a curtain of love grass roots. Again, the early born calf's tail freezes to the earth, and again, we take the hacksaw to it so she might live. Again, the hawk snatch lands and pins the rat snake to the fence's barbs and eats that way in peace without having to suffer its coiled writhing again and again. Tell me why not? Tell me our species matters more. Tell me that, and I will crawl back, hold your face to the soil, and show you what we're fighting for. So, killer poem, so powerful. But look at the images. The images are telling the story, right? We've got the honeysuckle's throat, a plunge down it, big-eared bat that's caught, plastered to drapes, right? And being swept free with a broom, right? I mean, just image after image after image just tumbling out at you. And that creates an energy and an intensity, having all of these images tumble towards you. And that is part of the greater meaning of this poem. I think this poem is a great example of what a lot of us could strive for in how can we capture an intensity of feeling or something we're passionate about in a way that's fresh and interesting and not on the nose, right? He doesn't just say it, he shows it. And this is the kind of work that is celebrated and winning prizes and getting publication. All right, so these are a bunch of exercises to work on heightening your abilities. So I just have some suggestions here. Describe a place using a repeated phrase as a refrain. Start each stanza with it. Use all the senses. Describe someone using non-human metaphors, similar to Sylvia Plath. Describe a landscape you know well in a long string of images, and try to make some of them rhyme. And then describe one very small physical part of a landscape, like a tidal pool rather than the whole ocean or beach, in great physical detail. Okay, now the unexpected. So when you first are writing a draft, you, like me, like most people, we tend to go for the phrases that just come to us, either ones that we grew up with or ones that just naturally come. There's all kinds of expressions people use, and people use them all the time in poetry. And using cliches in poetry is never a good idea unless you're somehow making some kind of ironic statement about it, which is hard to do. But like sleeping with the fishes, buried the hatchet, knight in shining armor, ruby red lips, right? No. There are universal experiences that we're all writing about. Love and death and sex and birth and ordinary everyday life and going for a walk and watching spring come or watching autumn come, take all the leaves off the trees, or watching the first snowfall, or losing a parent or a friend, or all these other things. How can you make your poems using these things we see? There's a blue sky right there. There's white clouds right there, right? All these things happen to all of us, but how can we make them our own? We have to turn them on our heads, and we have to get rid of every cliche, first of all. But look for the connections that are not obvious. Don't compare things that are similar. Compare things that are different. So connecting your ideas to unrelated images can give you striking imagery, right? So here I say, how is the sun like a shoe? How is the sky like a fish? And the point is to get creative, really creative. What we're doing is a creative endeavor. Poetry is inherently creative. We have to push ourselves out of our comfort and write things that are new. Okay, so your job as a poet is to shepherd. You are the shepherd of the reader. You shepherd them to meaning, right? So you create the cohesion. So here I thought this was powerful. This is Pantoum from the Window of the Room Where I Write by Alison Townsend. She writes, I could not know my mother would die young. The tree is a galleon, its sails coppered by light. So the tree is a ship, right? A galleon ship. Its sails coppered by light. So the sails are like leaves. I stand here watching, older now than she ever was. I raked leaves into rooms and houses as a girl. Here I think you have a beautiful example of a poem that sandwiches, right? A line that sort of tells you the story. I could not know my mother would die young. That's powerful. Then we switch to an unusual series of images. A tree is a galleon, its sails coppered by light. Then again, I stand here watching, older now than she ever was. We have story. And then another interesting image. I raked leaves into rooms and houses as a girl. So here we have this interesting zigzag of story and unusual imagery, story, unusual imagery. So don't fall in the trap of comparing anything to something it closely resembles. Delve deeper. Some practice. How can your details and images replace exposition and do the heavy lifting? You got to show instead of tell, and let's look at some more examples. All right, Jack Gilbert, one of my favorites. He was also ahead of his time. He was writing using really unusual connections and images back in the 50s and 60s. This is a beautiful poem about his wife dying. It's called Finding Something. He's a poet really worth reading. You should check out his collected works. I say moon is horses in the tempered dark, because horse is the closest I can get to it. I sit on the terrace of this worn villa the king's telegrapher built on the mountain that looks down on a blue sea and the small white ferry that crosses slowly to the next island each noon. Mashiko is dying in the house behind me. The long windows open so I can hear the faint sound she will make when she wants watermelon to suck on, or so I can take her to a bucket in the corner of the high-ceilinged room, which is the best we can do for a chamber pot. She will lean against my leg as she sits so as not to fall over in her weakness. How strange and fine to get so near to it. The arches of her feet are like voices of children calling in the grove of lemon trees, where my heart is as helpless as crushed birds. Bam. You have this beautiful poem that's telling the story, full of imagery. There's the white fairy, right? There's the chamber pot, a bucket being used for a chamber pot. And then we end with this absolutely exquisite series of images. Arches of her feet are like voices of children. How unusual is that, comparing the arches of someone's feet to the voices of children? It's amazing. It's so creative and innovative. Then they're calling in a grove of lemon trees. So now our sense of smell is being invoked, where my heart is as helpless as crushed birds. Exquisite, and all these images are so unrelated, and he brings them together to make this exquisite image. All right, another one from Ruth Awad. My father dreams of a new country. America, I see through your glass. I stretch my hand and my fingerprints are everywhere. Like leaves the gust blows in. I don't have money to feed your fountains or enough water that it's never a wish. But America, I can't stop drinking you in. Your trains, they're freight like hours, like the vowels cut from my name. When will you learn my name? I'm running to you, but I can't get there fast enough. I'm strung up on gridirons and city lights. Aren't my arms tired of reaching? Isn't my back tired of carrying this night around? Be good to me like a summer rain. I swear I'm burning. Another really wonderful poem. So here we have glass. We have her hands and the fingerprints. So we're seeing fingerprints. We see glass. She's stretching her hand. Leaves that gusts are blowing in. So there's a sensation of movement and emptiness. I don't have money to feed your fountains or enough water. Then there's into the next stanza, drinking you in. So that's carrying the image of water and fountains over into the next stanza. And then we quickly move to another series of images. Trains. They're freight like hours. Again, here, like Jack Gilbert, she's comparing freight to hours. Things that you would never normally compare. But here, there's something powerful that happens with her comparison. The heaviness of time, the heaviness of cargo, right? These things start to become woven together. Like the vowels cut from my name. When will you learn my name? And then strung up on gridirons and city lights, we have that beautiful internal rhyme and this image of gridirons and lights and cities. Are my arms tired of reaching? There's that sensation being evoked. Isn't my back tired of carrying this night around? So again, it's the story of an immigrant coming to America, and the sights and the sounds and the heaviness of the burden is so beautifully done here. So this is something fun that I like to do if I'm feeling stuck. If I'm writing a poem and like the things that are coming out are just ordinary, which happens, I'll make these fun lists. So I'll make a list of nouns and I'll just start writing down all the ordinary nouns. I'll look out my window and I'll be like, oh, house, fire hydrant, cat, there's a tree, there's a lilac, there's a neighbor. So I'll just make a list of nouns. Here I have house, fire, cat, tree, fish, sea, chair, feet, cigarette, building. Then won't look at that list and I'll make another list, just adjectives at random. trembling, tiger-striped, crestfallen, crumpled, abrupt, variegated, weary, harmonious, lucky, eager. And I'll take those 2 lists and I'll jumble them up and I'll see what happens. You know, are my feet tiger striped? Is the building crumpled? Is the sea abrupt, right? Is the fire eager? All of a sudden we have new meanings come out when we start to describe things in different ways. So I recommend this activity for everybody to do when you're feeling a little stale or stuck. All right, so I did that when I was writing some of these poems, and I thought I would share little pieces with you. So I wrote this poem working on certainties. I'm watching my daughter grow, her hair darkening to honey, her feet like blue canoes swimming the dark currents of our apartment floor. So here I was like thinking about her feet. My daughter is tiny and she has big feet. I'm like, gosh, they're like canoes. I'm like, they're like blue canoes. And then I thought, blue canoes swimming the apartment floor. And I just went for it. And I like it. I like what is evoked there. Then I'm writing this poem about Florida. I'm from South Florida originally, and there's endless material there. But so I'm writing a little biography of Florida. And so I wrote this section where I really tried to liven it up. And so I say, even when I remember the winter light painting the rooms blue and gold as church, the air is thick with the breath of your swamps. The clouds carry their awkward luggage, thunder and choke, rifting puddles born from the strip mall shoppers' tears. So it's just all these different ideas and images from different experiences growing up in Florida, all jumbled together to create a sensation of just heaviness, some sorrow, the weather, you know, awkward luggage. I was kind of thinking about people who move there and tourists. It's such a transient place. All right, so another really fun practice is you write a little poem or a little piece of something with no adjectives, only nouns. So I wrote this little thing for this activity. As a girl, I would dream about the moon where it stood in the sky. And I wouldn't feel alone the nights my parents hosted their parties, our house echoing with the laughter of strangers. So I was like, okay, I've got a little scene here, simple. Now let's start adding things to it. Okay, so how can you make it interesting? How can you make everything a zinger? How can you make everything fresh? So I thought, okay, so these parties used to happen around the holidays. How about the full cold moon in December? So as a girl, I would dream about the full cold moon, its tender face, its chewing gum breath like the doublemint kiss I was waiting to come. I would watch for it to prick my room with light like a cigarette end, feeling less alone when my parents hosted holiday parties, our house echoing with the laughter of strangers, of politics, my door locked against the tipsy men in search of the toilet. So here, what I was trying to get across was that kind of burgeoning pre-sexuality of kind of being, you know, a 8 or 9-year-old, 10-year-old girl. And there's kind of a sexuality at the edges of things, kind of on the periphery. And so here, I'm sort of touching on that. The doublemint kiss has like an innocence. And then to prick my room like a cigarette end, and then the door locked against the tipsy men. You know, it's like there's sexuality trying to get in. That's how I did that and what I was sort of going for. I don't know what this will become. It might become something, but I'm sharing my drafting process because I like to be transparent. Okay, wow, that's pretty good. I have 2 seconds left. So if you're interested in doing workshops or in talking more about this topic or in talking more about anything that came up, you can go to my website, megansterling.com, or you can contact me. My email address is on there. I do one-on-one poetry feedback. I also do manuscript feedback. So I'm available for people who have questions because I really love to help people on their journey to following your dreams of being a published poet. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was wonderful. My head is full of so many thoughtful images. Yeah, you've given us a lot to contemplate. That was great. Can you go ahead and exit your screen share, please?
Oh, of course. Thank
That's
you for
great.
reminding me. Stay up there
now
all day.
we can see you. Yeah, so you recently had your book published with a good press, and I know that's something so many poets think of doing and dream about doing, but it's so daunting for so many people. Can you talk a little bit about the process for that and how that happens?
Yes. So this is my first full-length collection, and I started doing some searches for presses that were looking for manuscripts, and I made a little list. And I did research, like we all have to do. You have to research every place you submit to make sure you're a fit. And so I looked up the different presses that I was interested in applying. They all had a deadline, which was coming up right before I was about to submit, which was in August of last year. And I looked up who they were publishing, the kinds of manuscripts they were publishing. And I got a sense from the one that I ended up with, which is Terrapin Books, that the people who were being published are a lot of professors who teach writing. So a lot of them were people like around my age or a little bit older, a little bit younger, but not like super young or super old. There was sort of a good range of ages being published. So that let me know a number of things that these people, I also looked at their bios, and they were published in lots of really good magazines and journals. So I felt like this was a crew that I wanted to hang with, if that makes any sense. So I, very carefully read all the requirements, and I submitted, and I was absolutely shocked when very shortly after I received word that like, yes, we want it, because I had just started. I mean, I know people who've been submitting for years. So I think that doing your research, I also really spent a lot of time with that manuscript. I have to tell you, I think for a lot of poets, we fall in love with a poem, like we write it and then we like send it off that day.
Yeah.
Or we like just finish our manuscript and we send it off. Please don't do that. This manuscript had to sit and wait and get revisited probably 3 full times before I sent it out. And the reason it sat so long is because I have a little girl who takes so much time, and of course working, but I spent, I revisited that manuscript and honed it. I had a couple of readers read it before I felt, okay, you're ready, go. So I think really making sure that manuscript has had time to sit with you not looking at it, to revisit it with fresh eyes, at least a few times, getting a little outside input from it, having someone read it, getting some feedback, and then researching the presses.
Yeah,
really make sure you're a fit.
I think that was really smart of you to look at the people who the presses were published and to really get a sense of where they were in terms of their publishing careers. Exactly. When you were reading their bios, did you have a sense that like your bio would ultimately be comparable?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that's a really good idea. And it seems to me that there's a process to building a bio too, like getting published in those magazines. And
well, another thing that on top of that is, I don't know, but how much people know about this, but in order for a manuscript to get published, you have to have a sizable chunk of the poems inside of it already published elsewhere. So getting published in all of those journals is actually part of the process of having your manuscript published. A lot of journals, it's between 30 and 40% of the poems inside of it have to have already been published in different magazines and journals. So building your bio is part of getting your manuscript out there.
Yeah, that's exactly it. For those interested, Authors Published does, we give away a book called Submit, Publish, Repeat, and that teaches you how to get published in literary journals. Which if you're interested in pursuing that, that's something you should look up. So let's talk a little bit more about imagery. And something that I often encounter with my own writing is I have very disparate imagery, and people, like, I get feedback on the poem and people say it doesn't really make sense or I can't follow it. How do you, when you're writing, like, how do you think about like making sure like there's these connections that make sense and that it's actually serving the poem?
Sure. So I think that the Ruth Awad example is My Father Dreams of His New Country. I think that's the title. Sorry if I'm messing it up. So a lot of the way that she does it, and also Jack Gilbert, those two examples both do it. They weave things, they continue things. So for example, and even that poem, Another Pastoral. So all of his images are within the realm of the natural world. He does it in a wild way, but they're all within the realm of the natural world. We've got the hawk and the snake and the bat and the honeysuckle and the grass, right? So that's one way you can kind of contain it within a theme, right?
Okay.
If you're going to write out like wild city images and keep those running through. So that's one way to do it. But both Jack Gilbert and Ruth Awad, they wove it again. So for example, when she had that second stanza, which talked about the fountains and the water, the next stanza, she talks about drinking. So there's a way to carry delicately, and maybe from a different angle, those seemingly disparate images so that they are being threaded through rather than just, stuck in there. But of course, that's about crafting. I mean, you can take a whole list of like amazing images and not make a great poem out of it because we have to craft these things. But that's another lecture for another time.
Yeah, there's endless possibilities for topics to explore with poetry.
For sure.
But it seems to me you're saying you want to make sure that there is a thread between the images, and not just a new image, but some sort of connection. Is that part of the revision process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think my stance is to always start big, if to start wilder and then hone it, because I think that a lot of poets can be afraid to take leaps, and I think that's what holds a lot of people back. So I think that if you start with lots of wild images, and then in the revision process, you start to hone, you start to make sure things are threaded, but that's revision. The most important thing, I think, is to start just opening yourself up completely to whatever wild stuff comes. Then we start to make sure that it evokes what we want it to.
That makes sense. That leads to a related question I have, which is, when you're writing a poem, do you start just by like coming up with imagery and not thinking about what your topic is or your meaning? And then do you discover the meaning afterwards, or?
All of the above. I mean, right? I mean, we have days where, so there might be a day where I sit down at my desk and I'm like, I got nothing. Got nothing. I'll start to write out words, or I'll try to find a word. Like I found this great word, lunule, which is the little moon on your fingernail. And I was like, I've got a poem. And then I just wrote from that word. Or sometimes I'll hear of a current event and I'll be really troubled. That's often a poem brewing, that troubled feeling that I just need to give it. So, or from a prompt or a topic. I mean, we come at the poems in all different ways, but if I'm feeling like nothing's happening upstairs, then I'll definitely start trying to find words or lists or something that will spark.
Yeah. So at the very least, if nothing's happening, you just go for the images, and then something may come out.
I'll also, sometimes I go on online and I'll look up like wacky English words, like
Oh,
wacky words in the English language.
yeah,
And I'll see
that
what
could
I
be.
find. And often I
Yeah,
find something really fun that
yeah.
leads me down some sort of poetry path.
Do you find that reading other poems tends to lead to more of this type of writing that you want in your own practice?
100%. I read a poem at least one poem every morning, usually more.
Do
Yes.
you have like a poetry reading habit?
Yes. I do.
Yeah, every
So
morning?
I always check Rattle every morning.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
really love all the different voices that
Mhm.
are coming. They're doing right now a tribute to neurodiversity that I'm just loving.
Oh, yeah.
It's so cool. Um, but yeah, I'll definitely, I have a lot of friends that are poets and I'll read their work. I'm in some Facebook groups of really amazing poets and they'll post new poems and I'll read their work.
Mhm.
And that definitely puts me in the mindset of writing. Or sometimes I'll read a poem, I'm like, I wish I wrote that.
I
And
know. Yeah.
sometimes that will lead me to create like my own version.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for sharing the lecture with us today and all those wonderful poems and images and ideas for creating new poems. We are going to be giving everyone a copy of the slides and the packet of exercises. For those who want to learn more about Megan, be sure to look her up, megansterling.com. If you have any questions for me or for Authors Publish, you can always email support@authorspublish.com. We're going to be having another lecture next month. We plan on just continuing the monthly lecture series. So thank you everyone for attending and thank you, Megan.
You're so welcome. It was a pleasure.